His lawyer leaned in and whispered just 5 words. Only 5. In an instant, the smug, self-satisfied mask Julian Vance had worn for 15 years shattered. His face turned a ghostly white, and those hands, the ones so eager to sign away our life, began to shake like dry leaves in a cold wind. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, I let myself smile. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand the patient, silent game a woman plays when she's been pushed too far. My name is Natalie Brooks, and until 3 months ago, I was just the loyal wife to a man building a hollow empire. I've spent a decade being the ghost in his machine, the silent architect of his success, only to be told I was no longer part of the vision. Before we get into how I handed him the keys to his own ruin, please hit that subscribe button to join our community. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? I read every single story you share. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the moment Julian thought he was taking everything, without realizing he was signing for a nightmare. The betrayal started not with a shout, but with the clinking of silverware against fine china. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of evening where I'd spent 40 minutes perfecting the sear on Julian's favorite steak. I was plating the greens when he sat down, not with the exhaustion of a hard-working CEO, but with the cold, calculated efficiency of a man closing a hostile takeover. "I want a divorce," he said, his voice as flat as the mahogany table between us. I froze, a serving spoon mid-air. I waited for the punchline, for the "just kidding," but Julian didn't blink. He reached into his blazer and slid a folder across the table. "I want the house. I want the cars. I want the business. Every asset. Every account. I've built this empire, Natalie, and I'm keeping it." He paused, taking a sip of water as if he were clearing his palate. "You can keep Nolan. He'll be better off with you in some modest apartment anyway." He said it like he was ordering a side dish. "I'll take the millions, hold the child. 15 years. That's how long I'd been his official wife and his unofficial everything else. When we met, Julian was 24 with a big dream and an empty bank account. I was the one who filed his first LLC. I was the one who managed the books until 2 a.m. while nursing our son. I was the architect of his reputation, the person who turned his vision into actual profit. And here he was, discarding me like a piece of outdated software. The next morning, the cavalry arrived, not to save me, but to salt the earth. His mother, Beatrice Vance, showed up with her designer handbag and a face full of practiced pity. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't hug her grandson. She walked straight to the closet. "Men have needs, Natalie," she sighed, draped in pearls as she tossed my sweaters into heavy-duty garbage bags. Not boxes, garbage bags. As if my 15 years of loyalty were nothing but literal trash. "Julian is at a different stage of life now. You should have tried harder to keep him interested. It's best you just sign the papers and leave quietly. Don't make this ugly." But the knife in the back didn't just come from my in-laws. It came from the person I trusted most, my best friend, Megan Miller. For 20 years, we were inseparable. She was the first person I called, sobbing, after Julian's announcement. She brought over wine, let me cry on her shoulder, and told me I deserved better. But then, the glitches started. If I mentioned a specific lawyer to Megan, Julian's team would block them the next day. If I told her I was looking at a certain neighborhood to move into, Julian would mock that exact area that evening. It clicked during a dinner party I wasn't supposed to attend. I saw the way Megan looked at him, the way she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, the way she touched his arm. My best friend wasn't a shoulder to cry on. She was a spy. She was auditioning for the role I hadn't even vacated yet. I felt the walls closing in. My husband was a stranger, my mother-in-law was a vulture, and my best friend was a traitor. They all looked at me and saw a defeated woman, a disposable housewife who would take her $50,000 settlement and disappear into the shadows. They had no idea that I had been watching the numbers for 3 years. They didn't know that while they were planning my exit, I was already documenting their downfall. In the world of Julian Vance, image was everything. But in my world, the truth was in the ledger, and the ledger was about to scream. Being underestimated is a superpower, but being ignored is a godsend. While Julian was busy parading Amber through my sage green kitchen, the one she was already planning to paint a depressing, sterile gray, he stopped looking at me. To him, I was just a ghost haunting the guest room, a broken woman waiting for her expiration date. He didn't realize that ghosts see everything. The truth began to unravel 3 years ago on a rainy Tuesday night. Julian was at the office, or so he said. I was sitting at the kitchen island, reconciling the company's year-end books, when I noticed a wire transfer that didn't make sense. Then another. I started digging, fueled by a gut feeling that felt like ice water in my veins. By 3 a.m., surrounded by stacks of digital bank statements, I realized my husband wasn't the real estate mogul the local magazines raved about. He was a professional magician, and his greatest trick was making money disappear. Julian had been playing a dangerous game of financial Russian roulette. He'd taken out a second mortgage on our home for $350,000, then a third for another $350,000. Total debt on a house we supposedly owned? $1.1 million. The market value was barely $850,000. We were drowning, $250,000 underwater on the roof over our heads. The business was a graveyard of bad decisions. Maxed out lines of credit, $85,000 in back taxes, and unpaid vendor bills that could fill a stadium. But where was the money going? It wasn't going to our mortgage or Nolan's college fund. I tracked it to failed cryptocurrency, moonshots, high-stakes gambling debts, and a secret luxury apartment for a woman who certainly wasn't me. He was wearing $15,000 watches while the foundation of our life was literally crumbling into dust. My first instinct was to scream, to throw the laptop at his head the moment he walked through the door. But I remembered my grandmother's voice, the woman who survived the Great Depression with a smile and a hidden stash of cash. A woman should always have her own, she'd say. Not secret money, just yours. I didn't confront him. I went to work. I called my uncle, a retired forensic accountant, and we moved with surgical precision. My grandmother had left me $340,000 when she passed, and I had another $180,000 from my years as a legal assistant before I quit to support Julian's dream. That $520,000 was my life raft. Under the law, since it was an inheritance and a premarital rollover never commingled with our joint accounts, it was mine. We set up an irrevocable trust for Nolan. Every cent of my separate property went into that vault. I wasn't the beneficiary. Julian certainly wasn't. It was for my son's future, his education, his first home, his safety net. It was untouchable. For 3 years I lived a lie to protect the truth. I smiled at charity galas while knowing the champagne was bought on credit we couldn't afford. I nodded when Julian bragged about his empire, knowing it was a house of cards soaked in gasoline. So, when Julian sat me down and demanded everything, I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. He thought he was taking the crown jewels. He had no idea he was demanding a mountain of debt that was about to landslide right on top of him. He wanted the house, the cars, and the business. Fine. He could have them, every single cent of them. The air in courtroom 4B tasted like floor wax and finality. It was Thursday, April 17th, the day Julian Vance expected to officially crown himself king of his own life. He sat across from me, looking every bit the part in a charcoal Armani suit, checking his new $15,000 watch with a bored, restless energy. In the hallway, I knew Amber was waiting, probably already picking out new curtains for a house she didn't realize was a financial ghost ship. I took my seat next to my attorney, Victoria Sterling. I wore a simple navy dress and no jewelry, my hair pulled back tightly. I played the role to perfection, the defeated wife, the woman who had lost her spark, the victim who had simply run out of fight. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, sat in the gallery, giving me that smug, thin-lipped smile that said, "I told you that you weren't enough for him." Vance versus Vance. Judge Patricia Holden announced, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. I understand a settlement has been reached? Julian's lawyer, Arthur Bennett, stood up with a confident clearing of his throat. Yes, Your Honor. My client, Julian Vance, will retain all marital assets, the primary residence, the real estate development firm, and all corporate vehicles. In exchange, Mrs. Brooks has agreed to a one-time cash settlement of $50,000 and primary custody of their son. The judge looked at me, her eyes softening with what looked like genuine pity. Mrs. Brooks, you've helped build this business for 15 years. You're sure you want to walk away with just this? I lowered my gaze, making my voice small and shaky. I just want him to have everything he asked for, Your Honor. I want this to be over. Julian leaned back, a triumphant smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was so blinded by his own ego, so intoxicated by the idea of winning, that he didn't even notice Victoria sliding a thick stack of documents across the table. These weren't just the divorce papers. They were the liability disclosure addendums. See, here's the thing about legal assets. They don't exist in a vacuum. Under the law, if you claim the house, you claim the mortgage. If you claim the business, you claim the liens. Julian had been so impatient to get me out of the picture that he had signed a waiver 2 weeks prior, refusing a full financial audit because he knew what his company was worth. He thought he was skipping the red tape. In reality, he was skipping his only chance to see the cliff he was about to drive over. The pens moved, the signatures were dry, and then the silence was broken by the sound of Arthur Bennett's frantic page-turning. I watched the exact moment the blood drained from Julian's face. It started at his forehead and washed down to his throat. Arthur whispered something, just 5 words, and Julian's hand, the one wearing that expensive watch, began to tremble. Your Honor! Julian suddenly stood up, his chair screeching against the linoleum. There's a mistake. These numbers, $1.1 million in mortgages, $500,000 in business debt, this is fraud. She hid this. Judge Holden's gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. Mr. Vance, sit down. These are your signatures on the bank loans. These are your mortgages, filed in your name, on your property. Are you telling this court you don't know your own financial standing? Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and pure, unadulterated terror. He realized then that he hadn't won a fortune. He had won a $1.9 million debt trap. He had won the right to be bankrupt by lunch. You knew, he hissed, his voice cracking. I met his gaze, no longer the defeated wife, but the woman who had managed his books for a decade. I was your bookkeeper for 11 years, Julian. I knew where every cent went. You said you wanted everything. Now, it's all yours. The gavel fell one last time. The agreement stands. This marriage is dissolved. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked out of the courtroom. I didn't look back at Julian, who was now slumped in his chair, or at Beatrice, whose jaw had dropped so low her pearls were practically touching the floor. I walked into the sunshine, took a deep breath of the fresh April air, and headed home to Nolan. Julian had his empire. I had my freedom. And for the first time in 15 years, the ledger was finally balanced. The aftermath wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, agonizing crumble. Within 2 weeks, the high-gloss life Julian had fought so hard to steal began to peel away like cheap wallpaper. Amber was the first to go. She didn't leave a tearful goodbye. She left a post-it note on the gray kitchen island that read, "This isn't what I signed up for." She was gone before the first foreclosure notice even hit the front door. It turns out, ride or die only applies when there's a Lamborghini in the driveway. By the second month, the real estate king was wearing a suit that was starting to look too big for him. The banks didn't care about his vision or his ego. They cared about the $1.1 million he owed on a house that was worth $300,000 less than the debt. The business accounts were frozen. The vendors he'd ignored for years finally stopped calling and started filing. The empire Julian had paraded in front of me was revealed for what it truly was, a hollow shell held together by pride and unpaid bills. Beatrice stopped bragging at her country club. The woman who had packed my life into garbage bags was now the one scrambling, trying to figure out why her perfect son was asking her for loans just to keep the lights on. The local gossip shifted from my failed marriage to Julian's spectacular financial freefall. But for me, the world had never been quieter or more beautiful. Nolan and I moved into a two-bedroom apartment. It was small, sure. The kitchen was barely the size of our old pantry. But on the first night, we sat at a secondhand table and I let him pick the paint color. He chose a soft, calming sage green. As we rolled the paint onto the walls, Nolan looked at me with those serious, observant eyes. Eyes that had seen too much, but finally understood the truth. "You waited, didn't you, Mom?" he asked quietly. "You knew the whole time." I put the roller down and hugged him. It was a real hug, the kind a 15-year-old gives when he realizes his mother isn't a victim, but a protector. "I needed to make sure your future was safe, Nolan. That's all that ever mattered." That $520,000 trust fund? It sat untouched, growing quietly, a fortress around my son's future. He wouldn't have to worry about college or his first home. I had traded a mansion built on lies for a life built on solid ground. I finally did what I had put on hold 10 years ago. I enrolled in an interior design certification program. My first client was a woman named Sandra, who was also starting over after a long, bitter divorce. When I walked into her empty apartment, she looked at me with a hollow expression I knew all too well. "Where do we even start?" she asked. I smiled, opening my portfolio. "One room at a time, Sandra. One color at a time." 3 months after the divorce, Julian showed up at my door. He looked like a ghost of the man I once knew. His expensive watch was gone, sold for cents on the dollar, and his eyes were bloodshot. "I didn't know it was this bad, Natalie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I made mistakes. Can we just talk? Can you help me figure this out?" I leaned against the doorframe of my small, sage-green apartment. I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of those garbage bags on my front lawn. "You asked for everything, Julian," I said calmly. "And I gave it to you. You're finally the king of your own mountain. It's not my fault the mountain is made of debt." I closed the door. I didn't do it out of malice, but out of peace. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't managing a man's ego or fixing a man's messes. I walked back into my living room, sat down with my son, and realized that while Julian had taken everything, I was the one who had walked away with the only things that truly mattered: my son, my dignity, and my future. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey. If this story reminded you to always know your worth and protect your heart, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel, From My Heart, for more stories of resilience and justice. Remember, your value isn't defined by what you lose, but by what you have the courage to build from the ashes. I'll see you in the next one. Your Honor! Julian suddenly stood up, his chair screeching against the linoleum. "There's a mistake. These numbers, $1.1 million in mortgages, $500,000 in business debt. This is fraud. She hid this." Judge Holden's gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. "Mr. Vance, sit down. These are your signatures on the bank loans. These are your mortgages, filed in your name, on your property. Are you telling this court you don't know your own financial standing?" Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and pure, unadulterated terror. He realized then that he hadn't won a fortune. He had won a $1.9 million debt trap. He had won the right to be bankrupt by lunch. "You knew," he hissed, his voice cracking. I met his gaze, no longer the defeated wife, but the woman who had managed his books for a decade. "I was your bookkeeper for 11 years, Julian. I knew where every cent went. You said you wanted everything. Now, it's all yours."